Medieval India through the eyes of foreign travelers. Many historical scriptures reveal that India was a popular destination for many foreign travelers. Many of these travelers were well educated and widely traveled, having a good status in their country of their origin. They went back and recorded the experiences of their travel and made our country popular among the citizens of their country. In this audio essay, we will recapture the account of their travel in a summary manner. Al-Biruni, who was a traveler from Khwarizm, which is presently Uzbekistan. He was well versed in several languages such as Syrian, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew and Sanskrit. In 1017, when Sultan Muhammad invaded Khwarizm, he took Al-Biruni and several scholars and poets to his capital, Ghazni. It was at this time in Ghazni, Biruni got fascinated towards India as he read lots of the Sanskrit works on mathematics, astronomy and medicines which were translated in Arabic. When Punjab became part of the Ghazni Empire, Al-Biruni got the opportunity to travel extensively in northern India, and he spent years in the company of Brahmin priests and scholars, learning Sanskrit and studying religious and philosophical texts. While his itinerary is not clear, the travel literature which came in the 8th century dealt with lands as far as that of the Sahara Desert in the west to the river Volga in the north. This travel literature was named as Kitab-ul-Hind and was written by Al-Biruni in Arabic, which is simple and lucid. It is a voluminous text divided into 80 chapters on subjects such as religion, philosophy, festivals, astronomy, alchemy, customs, social life, weights and measures, iconography, laws, and meteorology. Early chapter in the book begins with questions followed by description in Sanskrit and concluding with comparisons with other cultures. Al-Biruni, who wrote his work in Arabic, also translated it in Sanskrit, probably with an intent that his work is read by more people living along the frontiers of the subcontinent. He was familiar with translations and adaptations of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit text into Arabic. However, he was also critical about the ways in which these texts were written and clearly wanted to improve upon them. Ibn Battuta's books of travels, called Rihala, written in Arabic, provides an extremely rich and interesting detail about the social and cultural life in the subcontinent in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler was born in Tangier and received literary and scholastic education when he was quite young. He just loved traveling and went to far-off places exploring new worlds and peoples. Before he set off for India in 1332, he had made a pilgrimage trip to Mecca and had already traveled extensively in Syria, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, Oman and a few trading ports on the coast of East Africa. Traveling overland to Central Asia, Ibn Battuta reached Sindh in 1333 and from there he set off to Delhi. He had heard about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, as a generous patron of arts and letters. The Sultan was impressed by Battuta's immense knowledge and appointed him the quiz or judge of Delhi. He remained in this position for several years. In 1342, he was ordered to proceed to China as the Sultan's envoy to the Mongol ruler. With this new assignment, Ibn Battuta proceeded to the Malabar coast through central India. From Malabar, he went to the Maldives where he stayed for 18 months as the Qazi, but eventually decided to proceed to Sri Lanka. From there he started a sea journey to China and visited Bengal and Assam as well. He travelled extensively in China, going as far as Beijing, but did not stay for long, deciding to return home to Morocco in 1347. Ibn Battuta's account is often compared with that of Marco Polo, who visited China and also India from Venice in the late 13th century. Ibn Battuta meticulously recorded his observations about new cultures, peoples, beliefs, values, etc. We need to bear in mind that this globetrotter was travelling in the 14th century, when it was much more arduous and hazardous to travel than it is today. According to Ibn Battuta, it took 40 days to travel from Multan to Delhi and about 50 days from Sindh to Delhi. Moreover, travelling was also more insecure in those times. Ibn Battuta was attacked by bands of robbers several times. For instance, while travelling from Multan to Delhi, His caravan was attacked and many of his fellow travelers lost their lives. Those who survived, including him, were severely wounded. On his return, he wrote Rihala, a book which extensively describes all the traveling experiences and learning of Ibn Battuta. Brief accounts of Ibn Battuta stay in India. Rihala explicitly gives details of Battuta in India. For instance, by the time Battuta arrived in Delhi in the 14th century, the subcontinent was part of a global network of communications that stretched from China in the east to northwest Africa and Europe in the west. Ibn Battuta, while traveling extensively, visited several sacred shrines, spent time with learned scholars and rulers. He enjoyed the cosmopolitan culture of the urban centers, where people spoke Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and other languages, and shared ideas, information, and anecdotes which included stories about men noted for their piety, kings who could be both cruel and generous, and about the lives of ordinary men and women. Anything that was unfamiliar was particularly highlighted in the book in order to ensure that the listener or the reader was suitably impressed by accounts of distant yet accessible worlds. Some of the best examples of Battuta's strategies of representation are evident in the ways in which it described two kinds of coconut and the palm and the two kinds of plant produce that were completely unfamiliar to his audience. Let us now know about some of Rihala's description on Indian cities. Battuta found Indian cities full of exciting opportunities for those who had the necessary drive, resources and skills. They were densely populated and prosperous. It appears from Battuta's account that most cities had crowded streets and bright and colorful markets that were stacked with a wide variety of goods. Battuta described Delhi as the largest city with a great population. Daulatabad too easily rivaled Delhi in size. The bazaars were not only places of economic transactions but also the hub of social and cultural activities. Most bazaars had a mosque and a temple, and in some of them at least, spaces were marked for public performances by dancers, musicians and singers. While Battuta was not particularly concerned with explaining the prosperity of towns, historians have used his account to suggest that towns derived a significant portion of their wealth through the appropriation of surplus from villages. Battuta found Indian agriculture very productive because of the fertility of the soil, and India was well integrated with inter-Asian networks of trade and commerce. Indian manufacturers were in great demand in both West Asia and Southeast Asia, which fetched huge profits for artisans and merchants. Indian textiles, particularly cotton cloth, fine muslins, silks, brocade and satin were in great demand too. The state evidently took special measures to encourage merchants. Almost all trade routes were well supplied with inns and guest houses. Battuta was also amazed by the efficiency of the postal system, which allowed merchants not only to send information and to remit credit along long distances, but also to dispatch goods required at a short notice. The postal system was so efficient that while it took 50 days to reach Delhi from Sindh, the news reports of spies would reach the Sultan through the postal system in just 5 days. In the centuries between 1400 and 1800, visitors to India wrote a number of travelogues in Persian. These writers followed in the footsteps of Al-Biruni and Battuta. Razak Samarkandi visited South India in the 1440s. Mahmud Wali Balkhi in 1620s and Sheikh Ali Hazin in 1740s. There is a good amount of traveler scenario from 15th to 16th century. The Portuguese arrived in India in 15th century. Their travelers highlighted more in detail the Indian social and religious practices of that time. A few of them, such as the Jesuit Roberto Nobili, even translated Indian texts into European languages. Among the best known of the Portuguese writers is Duarte Barbosa, who wrote a detailed account of trade and society of South India. In 16th century, India witnessed travelers from Dutch, England and France. One of the most famous among them was the French jeweler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who travelled to India at least 6 times. He was particularly fascinated with the trading conditions in India and compared India to Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Some of these travelers even settled down in India. Francois Bernier, a French traveler, was one notable traveler. He was a doctor, political philosopher and historian. Like many others, he came to the Mughal Empire in search of opportunities. He was in India for 12 years from 1656 to 1668 and was closely associated with the Mughal court as a physician to Prince Dara Shikoh and later as an intellectual and scientist with Danishmand Khan, an Armenian noble at the Mughal court. Bernier's writings became extremely popular after they were published in France in 1670 to 1671 and translated into English, Dutch, German, and Italian within the next 5 years. Between 1670 and 1725, his accounts were reprinted several times both in English and French. This was in marked contrast to the accounts in Arabic and Persian, which circulated as manuscripts and were generally not published before 1800. Bernier's perception of India in comparison to the West. While Ibn Battuta chose to describe everything that impressed and excited him because of its novelty, Francois Bernier belonged to a different intellectual tradition. He was far more occupied with comparing and contrasting what he saw in India with the situation in Europe in general and France in particular, focusing on situations which he considered depressing. His idea seems to have been to influence policymakers and the intelligentsia to ensure that they made what he considered to be the right decisions. He constantly compared Mughal India with contemporary Europe, generally emphasizing the superiority of the latter. Therefore, his descriptions narrated things which Bernier interpreted himself but in reality were not the same. According to Bernier, the question of land ownership was one of the fundamental differences between Mughal India and Europe, as it lacked private property in the land of the former. He thought that in the Mughal Empire the emperor owned all the land and distributed it among his nobles, and that this had disastrous consequences on the economy and society. This perception was not unique to Bernier, but is found in most travelers' account of the 16th and 17th centuries. The absence of private property in land, as per him, disinterested the landlords to implement progressive measures and further led to the decline of agriculture, oppression of peasant classes, and downfall in the standards of living of all except the ruling nobles and emperor. This further led to the disparity in social class, with very rich and powerful rulers and poor peasants, who were mercilessly exploited by the rich class. There was no middle class in India. However, it was not like this. The documents of Mughal officials like Abul Azal indicates that the emperor was not the owner of the land. The state collected the land revenues from their subjects and in turn provided them protection and security. It is possible that the European travelers interpreted such taxes as rent because land revenue were often very high. Note that Bernier's biased descriptions influenced other Western theorists from the 18th century, like the French philosopher Montesquieu, and even Karl Marx from the 19th century, thus giving rise to a theory that if the central autonomy completely controls their subjects and further exploits them, it would lead to the downfall of social-economic aspects of society. However, this picture of Indian rural society was far from true. In fact, during the 16th and 17th centuries, rural society was characterized by considerable social and economic differentiation. At one end of the spectrum were the big zamindars who enjoyed superior rights in the land, and at the other the landless laborers. In between them was the big peasant who engaged and hired labor for production, and a section of the smaller peasants who, though owned land, could barely produce for a subsistence. Let us take a look at what were the Bernier's contradicting accounts of India. Bernier's projection that the Mughal state was tyrannical is true, but the description of the complex Indian society was contradicted. For instance, he felt that artisans had no incentive to improve the quality of their manufactures since profits were appropriated by the state. However, at the same time, he stated that the vast quantities of the world's precious metals flowed into India as manufacturers exported in exchange for gold and silver. He also noticed the existence of a prosperous merchant community engaged in long-distance exchange. The fact was, during the 17th century, about 15% of the population lived in towns, which was higher than that of Western Europe in the same period. In India, there were all kinds of towns, like for manufacturing, trading, and port towns, religious centers, etc. Their existence distinctively indicates prosperity of merchant communities and professional classes. Note that merchants were a strong community. In Western India, these groups were called as Mahajans, and their chief as the Nagar Seth. Other urban groups included professional classes such as physicians, teachers, lawyers, painters, and magicians. While some depended on imperial patronage, many made their living by serving other patrons, and the rest served the ordinary people in crowded markets or bazaars. Travelers' account on the conditions of the Indian women. Travelers who left written accounts were generally men who were intrigued by the condition of the woman in the subcontinent. Sometimes they took social inequities for granted as a natural state of affairs. For instance, slaves were openly sold in markets like any other commodity and were regularly exchanged as gifts. While Ibn Battuta reached Sindh, he purchased horses, camels, and slaves as gifts for Sultan Muhammad bin Tipu. The slaves were basically kept for domestic works. However, in Sultan's court, they were also experts in music and dance, and the Sultan also employed them to keep a watch on his nobles. Contemporary European travelers and writers often highlight the treatment of women as a crucial marker of difference between Western and Eastern societies. No wonder Bernier chose the practice of sati for detailed description. He noted that while some women seemed to embrace death cheerfully, others were forced to die. However, in reality, women's lives revolved around much more things besides the practice of sati. Their labor was crucial in both agriculture and non-agricultural production. Women from merchant families participated in commercial activities, sometimes even taking mercantile disputes to the court of law. It is therefore hard to believe, as written by many European travelers, that Indian women were just confined to the private spaces of their homes. To conclude now, the travelers' accounts provide us with a tantalizing glimpse of the lives of men and women during these centuries. However, their observations were often shaped by the context from which they came. At the same time, there were many aspects of social life which went unnoticed by these travelers.